Hey, you are listening to CareerShorts.com Star Talk podcast. I'm your host, Kelly Key. Today, our guest is Kari Heistad, CEO of Culture Coach International. Kari is a globetrotter. She leads her team from New England and Ireland, providing diversity and cross-culture training around the world, helping companies build higher functioning global teams. For her contribution and the continued growth of Culture Coach International, Kari has been recently named a rising star by the Women's Business Enterprise National Council. She is also an e-learning content partner and a speaker for CareerShorts.com. Welcome to the show, Kari.
Thank you, Kelly. I appreciate it.
We all know that you are truly a globetrotter, and globalization certainly has presented tremendous opportunities for companies, large and small. Come with the opportunities, though, are challenges to interact with colleagues, suppliers, and customers across time zones, cultures, and geographies. So what are some of the critical skill sets employers are looking for when they are expanding and operating globally?
Well, I think there's several things that need to keep in mind for folks when they think about working in a global environment. One of them is being understanding about how culture is impacting daily interactions. A lot of times people only tend to think about sort of culture and being the really big stuff, but in reality when you're working in a global environment, it's all the small daily interactions that may be different based on our cultural backgrounds that really impact us the most. So part of what you need to be aware of when you're working in a global environment is watching some of the assumptions that you make about how work should be done or why it should be done in a particular way. It's about understanding some of your own cultural background and how that impacts how you see the world. And in doing so, then how other people's backgrounds impact them so that they understand sort of the differences and the similarities, because there is possible to find similarities across all cultural backgrounds, and we need to use those as well. And part of it is just being very curious about the world, being open to learning, because no one's ever going to be a cultural expert on all cultures around the world. There's just too many of us and too many people out there. So it is about sort of being open to learning, asking a lot of questions if you don't understand. And if you are working with a particular culture for an extended period of time, make sure you do some research in terms of learning about some of those cultural values and norms and their ways of doing business.
So the number one thing here is do not make assumptions and do not assume what is a cultural norm for yourself is also for those that you are interact from different parts of the world. And secondly, you're absolutely right. And these days, there are so many cultures and so many different group of people. There's no way for us to know all of them at one time. So continuous learning definitely is a critical capability for someone to truly become a globetrotter and working effectively in an intercultural setting. Well,
Absolutely.
Yes, and it goes along with that topic. You know, whenever we are working in a global environment, a big part of that teaming environment is actually virtual. You don't always get to meet your global colleagues. You might text messaging the person, email the person. You might even get onto Skype to do a video call. For these type of virtual teams, when they're managed well, obviously they can be very efficient and definitely cost effective. But when they are not managed well, it can also become a significant drain to a company's productivity. In your years of consulting with companies, helping them to build global teams, did you see some leading practices that work out particularly well with companies in forming and growing these type of global virtual teams?
Absolutely. There's a bunch of different best practices that we could talk about. One of them is that a lot of times people start these virtual teams, but they don't ever give teams a chance to kind of get to know each other as people. And certainly for global teams, one of the things that's really critical is give people the chance. Maybe it's a whole conversation that's just about sort of who they are and people introducing themselves and their roles on the team and things like that. And maybe it's sort of adding a few minutes before each meeting to allow people to do that, so that people feel that they get to know the people that they're working with as opposed to a title. And that allows you to develop some of that more cohesive teamwork when you're working sort of in all the different areas around the world. There's also some pieces that go along with a lot of the logistics on working on global teams. So it's making sure that if a company is headquartered in the United States, for example, and they've got offices in India and France, that when they do global conference calls, they're not always just between the hours of 9 to 5 in the United States, which puts it quite often in the middle of the night for somebody else on the other side of the world. So making sure that you trade off on times when meetings are scheduled so that everybody gets a chance to be up in the middle of the night and everybody gets a chance to kind of do it in normal business time is part of it.
Yeah.
And then a couple other practices that I'd really recommend for teams is that when you are doing meetings, you send very detailed agendas ahead of time. Sometimes meetings don't even get agendas at all, and sometimes when they do, it's just 3 bullet points with 4 words on each one, and it's not really describing what's happening.
That's right.
And so because you're working with people from different cultural backgrounds and who may be functioning in an English language, which is not their primary language,
Yeah.
it becomes really important to make sure that you give as much information as you can ahead of time. And then afterwards, once the meeting is done, that you write up minutes for what's actually happened in the meeting so that people have a chance to clarify and double check that they actually have understood accurately what has happened and what is expected kind of going forward. Because I think on global teams, English is increasingly the common language.
Yep.
But for people who have English as a native language, they forget that other people may be working in a second, third, or even fourth language. And so they tend to talk really quickly, sometimes use a lot of acronyms that people don't understand, and forget that in a global conference call environment, there's also that lag time. And so it's about being sensitive to not only the language people are speaking, but allowing the lag time for people to engage and to answer questions versus presuming that, a nanosecond of silence means that they don't have anything to say and kind of moving forward.
Definitely. That's really well said. Number one, the team might be virtual, but the relationships are still interpersonal, right?
Mm-hmm.
So spend the
Yep.
time to really get to know each other as an individual rather than just as a voice across, the line or wireless line, whatever that you have at the company. And the second thing is because we are interacting with the folks across the different parts of the world, different cultures, so be considerate of each other, right? You mentioned about the logistics. Don't always let the Indian people, the Chinese people waking up in the middle of the night. Let's share the burden, right? And another thing is in terms of language. When it comes to business interaction, indeed, I have to say English probably is the common denominator. But there are people whose first language is not English. So trying to be considerate, using plain good English that not only helps your teammates from different parts of the world, but actually is also good business practices, just a simple English. And some of the other things I thought you touched upon here is great is also be prepared, right? Before the meeting, have an agenda. After meeting, summarize it and get it down in writing. Those are all small but important techniques that probably every company, large or small, can immediately deploy to help them build a more effective virtual team.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head.
I hit the nail on the head. Okay, all right. Well, I'm going to shift the conversation a bit. You consulted with companies and a lot of leaders across different parts of the world. What is the general sense you are getting from this leader group? How worried they are in terms of their workforce readiness to compete in a global environment?
Well, I think there's sort of two things that go on here. One is recognizing the fact that international travel and sort of global business used to only be sort of in the responsibility area of kind of a senior management team on a company.
Yeah.
And in the last 10 to 15 years, due to technology, it's now every single person in the organization could be dealing with somebody in another country on a daily basis or sometimes 15 or 20 times a day. So that fundamental shift has meant that the concept of cultural competency and cultural sort of abilities to function well must go from not just your senior manager level, but into the entire organization. And for a lot of companies, that's a really big shift. And I would say that some of them are doing it really well, and they've sort of invested in that, and they understand that that's their future, and they've leveraged the talents that they've got for people from other cultures in the environment to help to teach the environment as well as help employees to learn about other cultures. And then there are some companies that even though they may have an office in India or China or something like that, they aren't truly thinking globally. They're thinking very much as sort of, well, we're based in the United States and we just happen to have a few employees over there, and they haven't invested in that training. So I would say there's a wide range throughout industries that I've worked with, and I've worked with a whole variety of them in terms of how ready people actually are. And some of it is helping them to understand sort of in the United States that multicultural environment or that cultural competency level can be critical even if you don't have operations overseas. If you take healthcare, for instance, the United States is 12.5% of its population is foreign-born. Everybody needs healthcare services. And so healthcare has been one of those industries where, because they're serving such a multicultural environment, even though they may not have hospitals overseas, they've had to develop a very high level of cultural competency because they literally have the world coming to their door for services. So a lot of times people think they only really need to think about the cultural competency piece if they're sending people other places.
Yeah.
But in reality, that multicultural skill set is really needed no matter whether you're working in a local neighborhood and reaching out to a community you don't normally serve, or you're serving a very multicultural employee base or patient base that might be coming to your institution, wherever it may be.
That's really an excellent point, because that's really what globalization brings to you, right? You're not only operating in a global environment, and now you suddenly have this tremendous opportunity to sell to every corner of the world. So because the customer base is so diverse, that almost forces the company to see cultural diversity being part of the competitive advantage. When you can truly connect with your customer, I think that's when your brand name really stand out more.
Yep.
That's really well said. Really well said. And last but not least, as a successful women entrepreneur, what are some of the advice you have for our listeners out there, women or men, who are looking to start a new career or a new business?
Well, I would say, first of all, be passionate. Find yourself either a position or a business that you truly love and that you can truly be passionate about. I know that when people talk to me all the time, they look at me and they've only been with me like 2 minutes, and they're like, "You really love what you do, don't you?" I'm like, "Yep, this is what I was born to do." And they're like, "Okay." Now, for some people who don't function in my field and might think it's not very much fun, they're kind of looking at me like a Martian with 5 heads. But for me, this is what I love to do. And so for me, owning my business, even though as a business entrepreneur, I work really long hours, I love what I do, and so I don't dread coming to work.
Yeah.
And, so I think that's part of it, is finding your heart, finding your passion. And I think the other piece is sort of being the type of employee or being the type of business owner that is the type of person you'd want to hang out with. I think a lot of times, we try and say, well, the other employees, or I don't like the people I work with, or whatever that might be. And I always come back to a leadership principle which somebody taught me a long time ago, which was, look in the mirror. Are you the type of person who would attract the people that you want to hang out with? And that's really, I think, when you think about sort of going into business, or you think about a new career or where you're going, it's about really resonating with sort of who you really are and making sure that you're the type of person that other people would either want to work with or who would want to work with in a company in terms of as a fellow employee. And so I think it really comes down to how you actually find your passion, and then how do you work on yourself enough to know that you're really living the principles and the values that you want to be working in, sort of the work environment that you want to be, and then making sure that you surround yourself with those other people. I think the other piece that I would suggest to people, too, is constantly to kind of asking yourself, what else could you be doing in terms of staying ahead of what's happening in industries? I've been in my industry for almost 20 years at this point. It has changed dramatically. And I was actually just having a conversation yesterday with a colleague, and we were saying, there's people who are our peers who've been in it as long as we have, but are still doing the exact same thing they were doing 20 years ago.
That's right.
And you can't afford to do that in business. I figure I've got about 18 months for any particular concept that I'm working on before it ages out. And if I'm going to stay ahead of my clients, then I need to be the one coming to them with ideas, saying, this is a new idea. How do we do this? This is what I see going on in the industry. How can I help you be successful? And whether you're doing it as a business person or you're doing it as an employee because you're thinking ahead about what the company needs and you're being proactive about it, it resonates no matter what. Because then you get to be seen as the proactive leader versus a reactive follower.
Yes,
and no matter where you are, that's a critical piece.
That's a critical piece. That's really, again, very well said there. I think there are two things, again, that I'm taking away. Number one, to find the right career path for yourself, you really have to have a good sense of self. What you are really passionate about, right? What kind of people you like to surround yourself with, like Kari said. The second piece is really be adaptive, because change is constant. You give yourself 18 months there, Kari, Kari, for implementing or try out any new business concept. I think that is not too different, even if you were employee of any given company. So constantly put yourself in the mode of learning new things, adapting new things. You will be standing in front of the rest of the competition. So thank you so much, Kari. I utterly enjoyed our conversation today, and thank you for spending time and share your insights with our audience. And for you out there, you've been listening to CareerShorts.com Star Talk podcast. I'm your host, Kelly Key. For more career and business resources, be sure to check out CareerShorts.com, the source for success.